Um, Now tonight we're gonna talk, like I said, we're gonna talk about the prophets. And one thing that I hope this class has done for you so far, and I know it's done this for me, is it has the passages and the types of literature that I felt more familiar with and more comfortable with, I'm starting to not feel shaky with, but I'm learning that I need to work harder. That maybe I've made some assumptions about what certain narrative, like for example, certain narratives. I've made some assumptions about what those narratives meant, and so it's challenged me to go back and address those assumptions and really try to come at the story afresh with no preconceived, no conceptions about what I think it should mean, and just let the story do its work. So I've run into that with some of the narratives, and maybe you have too. And I've definitely run into that with the epistles. So there are times and passages where I felt like I had a good grasp on it, and it's challenged me to really dig a little bit deeper and not assume that I have it down. But tonight, with the prophets, I really hope if you take from it what I have, I really hope that you will feel so much more comfortable and so much more confident opening up the prophets. For me, pretty much my entire life, and I'm no expert, but pretty much my entire life, the prophets just felt totally inaccessible. It was just this huge chunk of material right in the middle of the Bible that I had no idea what to do with. And I know it had stuff about the Messiah in there, but other than that, I didn't know much at all. So I hope that if you're like me and you really struggled with where do I even start, what do I even do with these passages, what do they mean, that you'll really feel like they're more approachable. Again, they're still very challenging, but I hope that you'll feel more confident that you have some tools in your tool belt whenever you dig into the prophets. This week we're talking about the prophets. Next week we're going to talk about the Psalms, and then the week after we're going to get into wisdom literature. So we're getting into a new type of literature, and that is poetry. We talked about narrative a couple weeks ago. Last week with the law, that's the type of literature called prose discourse. We're going to talk about that a lot more once we get to the epistles. But now, we're going to address it, but it's not quite narrative. It may have some narratives interspersed in it, but the law is more of a prose discourse. And now we're getting into the third main type of literature, which is poetry. And most of us, again, I'm assuming you're like me, don't know much about poetry, don't have a lot of appreciation for it, but I hope that after talking about it tonight, that we'll all develop a better appreciation of it, and a willingness to really dive into it. So poetry, narrative takes up almost half of all the biblical material, about 40% or just slightly over. Poetry is not far behind. Poetry is about a third of our entire Bible. All the prophets and wisdom literature is about the size of the entire New Testament. So it's a lot of material, and it's something that we really need to know how to address. And again, you may not love it, but I hope that you'll develop a little bit more of an appreciation for it after tonight, and after, obviously, that you do some of your own study. Just like every week, we don't have time, and I don't have the knowledge to really go talk about everything, but I hope that we, again, can give you some tools, but also kind of stir a desire to look for yourself now that we've talked about it and now that we've introduced it. So we're going to briefly go over a couple of things, a couple of features that are pretty common in Hebrew poetry. Again, we don't have time to go through a lot of it. There's entire books and volumes of material out there about how to read it and what's going on, all the theories behind it. But we're going to talk about just real basic. Hebrew poetry is different than how we do it. We typically think of rhyming and iambic pentameter and Shakespeare and whatnot. Now, that's not to say that there isn't wordplay going on in Hebrew poetry, because there definitely is. There definitely is rhyming. There definitely is meter and cadence and all those kinds of things. But we kind of lose that a lot of that in translation. But it's not the same as what we generally think of. It's more of a free verse kind of poetry. And Hebrew poetry generally occurs in couplets or triplets. So two lines that have some kind of relationship between each other, either two lines, or if it's a triplet, three lines. And there are three basic types of relationships between the two lines. The first type of relationship is a synonymous parallelism. So basically, the second line, line B, mirrors line A. It says something that is synonymous with line A. And I've got a good example from the book. It is from Isaiah 44, verse 22. It says, I have swept away your offenses like a cloud, your sins like the morning mist. Okay? So, again, the second line retells something in the first line. And again, poetry is it's very laden with meaning. It's just different than how we normally talk. So again, I hope that you'll kind of develop a bit of an appreciation for it. Again, I'm not a poet. I'm not a big, huge fan of it, but there is some beauty in it, and I hope that you'll start to dig into it. So there's synonymous parallelism. The next one is antithetical parallelism. Basically, the second line says the opposite of the first line. Okay? So an example from Hosea 7:14 says, they do not cry out to me from their hearts, but wail on their beds. So the second line says the opposite, or presents a, contrary thought in the second, compared to the first line. Okay? So synonymous parallelism, antithetical parallelism, and then the final one is synthetic parallelism, which is kind of a catch-all. Basically anything that doesn't fit into the first two categories kind of fits into synthetic parallelism. The second line doesn't say exactly what the first line says. It doesn't say the exact opposite. It just modifies or explains or adds additional detail to the second one. So it's kind of a catch-all. And again, another example is, here's Obadiah 21. That's verse 21, not chapter. Obadiah is much shorter. It says, deliverers will go up on Mount Zion to govern the mountains of Esau, and the kingdom will be the Lord's. So again, it's not presenting the same thought and not an opposite thought, just a modification, just something that adds to it, if you will. All right. So again, there's so much more going on in poetry than just that, but those are the most basic types that you'll see. You'll see that Hebrew poetry generally occurs in couplets or triplets, and there's some relationship between the two or three lines. And again, it generally falls into one of those categories. Another thing we want to be mindful of when we encounter poetry, whether we're talking the prophets, the Psalms, or wisdom literature, is that their culture has a different set of images and metaphors than we do. And one thing we really don't think about very often is so much of our language and so much of our thought even is tied up in metaphors. There's some really interesting books on it, but anyway, we'll talk about that later. So we want to try to familiarize ourselves with the imagery and the metaphors that are common in their culture. And you'll see them pop up all over the place. And so it kind of helps to have an idea of what some of these are. So I just have a list of some real common ones. The first one is the idea of the sea or the ocean as a source of chaos and danger. And we actually see this throughout the Bible, both in the Old and in the New Testament. So, I mean, we see it in Genesis 1, the world at the beginning is just this dark, chaotic, watery wasteland that God creates order out of. But we see it a lot in the what am I saying? In the poetry. So they'll talk about, water is, surging around me. And they might say that the nations around Israel are like the waters of chaos, and they're just beating away at the nation and trying to erode it, or something like that. So the ocean is generally thought of as chaos. Again, we see this even in Revelation, how in the new heaven and the new earth there is no sea. It's not about there being an ocean in heaven or not. It's saying that the forces of chaos and darkness are finally done away with. So water and the ocean, the sea is commonly this image of darkness, chaos, and danger. The next one is a rock or dry land. So again, if you're looking all the way back to the creation, God separates the chaotic waters and dry ground appears. God separates the waters at the Exodus and dry ground appears. So God is sometimes referred to as a rock or dry ground, because that's a place that's safe. That's habitable for humans. The ocean is not. That is not our territory. A lot of times they'll use imagery from the foundational stories. They'll pull imagery from the creation, the garden, the Exodus. Like they'll talk about the return from exile being a new Exodus, things like that. There'll be a lot of agricultural terms. They'll talk about different kinds of animals. So, having an idea of, is this a big animal or a small animal? Is this a strong animal or a weak animal? Is it majestic? It can kind of help give you an idea of what the poet is trying to say. And then trees, mountains. Mountains and trees are often places of religious significance. They were seen as places where kind of heaven and earth are meet, and so you'll see a lot of that as well. All right, so again, that's just super basic. Just a couple of things, couple of nuggets about when you encounter poetry. This is kind of some things to look for, just in general, whether it's prophets, whether it's the Psalms, or whether it's the wisdom literature. So now we're going to get specifically into the prophets. And the first thing we want to address is the nature of prophecy. If you ask anybody, anybody in our culture, in our society, what prophecy is, they're going to tell you it's about predicting the future or fortune telling. I'm pretty sure the first definition, in the dictionary is telling the future. And some prophets tell the future some of the time, but that's not all that prophecy is. That's a very small portion, actually, of what prophecy is, especially things that are future to us. So I think it's like 5% of all prophecy is messianic, 2% is about the new covenant age, and maybe only 1% is actually future to us. So the prophets did predict coming events and did speak of those coming events, but they were future to the audience, not to us. I mean, the overwhelming majority of what the prophets talk about, what they predicted, is past to us. Okay, so it's not just a bunch of future predictions. The purpose of prophecy and what a prophet was a mouthpiece for God. Okay, it didn't just mean, hey, this thing is going to happen, go tell the people. It's anything that God wanted to relay to an audience came through a prophet. So again, it's not about just telling the future. It's just being the mouthpiece for God. That's how God chose to get his message across, was through the use of these people. And it was not a popular job. Most of these people were persecuted and looked down on. They were strange. They had to do crazy and difficult things. Their life was not glamorous. You did not want to be a prophet, and you see this all over the place. When prophets got called, most of the time they were not happy about it because it was not a glamorous life. Again, the prophet speaks for God, and so much of what the prophets are doing is what the book calls covenant enforcement mediation. I've also heard it called covenant watchdogs. So the prophets were kind of like, and I don't mean to be trivial, but the prophets were kind of like the hall monitors of ancient Israel. And I mean, again, that's not a popular job, to enforce rules that people don't want to follow. But we talked about the law last week as being a covenant. It's an agreement. It's a marriage between God and Israel. And it outlined all the blessings and all the curses and all the stipulations. And the prophets are coming along and they're saying, hey, you are breaking this covenant. This is how you are breaking this covenant. And here are some things that are going to happen if nothing changes. And so their role primarily was covenant enforcement, watching over, trying to keep Israel accountable to the covenant that they had made, that they had agreed to at Sinai with Yahweh. All right. So we're going to dig into the historical context of the prophets. And again, this hopefully will really help you get your mind around where these events fall in the story. So in the very first episode, we talked about what's the story of Scripture. What is the overarching story that the Bible tells? So the prophets, their historical context is near the end of Act 1. Act 1 is the Old Testament narratives. They are right at the end of that. So Solomon's rule ends, the kingdom splits. There are 10 tribes in the north called Israel or Ephraim, and there are 2 tribes in the south, Judah and Benjamin, called Judah. And there's a civil war going on between them, and they are wildly unfaithful to the covenant. There are maybe a couple of decent kings in Judah. There are, I don't think, any good kings or monarchs in the northern kingdom during this time. And God sends prophets to both nations, and the northern kingdom is conquered by the nation of Assyria in 722 BC. They are deported and exiled and scattered, and they never return. So they do not come back. Okay, that nation is gone. The southern kingdom lasts for about 150 years more, and in 586 or 587, they fall to Babylon. And again, they are Jerusalem is destroyed. I think it's on the third wave of, so Nebuchadnezzar comes, I think, 3 times. And the third time he destroys the temple, takes exiles at each wave. I think Ezekiel was in the first wave of exiles taken to Babylon. And so some of those exiles do return after about 70 years. So that's kind of what's going on. A lot of the narrative events are going to take place in the books of Kings, and then some of the return from the Babylonian exile are going to take place in Ezra and Nehemiah. So there are 14 prophetic books. There are 4 major prophets and 12 minor prophets. Major and minor have nothing to do with importance. It's just longer and shorter. That's all it means. So the 4 major prophets are Jeremiah, Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. And then the 12 minor are all the other ones. So the books of Amos and Hosea, the audience for those prophets is primarily Israel. It's the northern kingdom. And they are delivering messages prior to the fall to Assyria in 722. So Amos and Hosea are generally the messages to the northern kingdom. And again, Like we talked about before, you may need a good commentary or a good Bible dictionary to kind of help with these things. Or if you've got a good study Bible, it probably has maybe an introduction to each book. So again, you don't necessarily have to memorize all of these things, but whenever you do encounter these books, whenever you do study them, you definitely want to know the specific audience and what was going on at that time. So that means, maybe, especially if there's a reference in the prophet to what king was reigning, what year it was, you want to go over to Kings or Chronicles or Ezra or Nehemiah and see and read some of those narratives. Try to figure out what's going on. What's my context? Again, what's my historical context? That's how we do good exegesis, is we have to figure out what's my original audience and what's going on that the prophet is talking about, the prophet's addressing. So Amos and Hosea, Northern Kingdom, Israel. Then we have most of the rest of them involve the Southern Kingdom. So there's Isaiah, Jeremiah, Joel, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, and Ezekiel. Those are directed at Judah, and those are either before or during the exile. Like Ezekiel is prophesying, again, he was taken like in the first wave of exiles to Babylon. So he's kind of preaching during the time of the exile, before the fall of Jerusalem. And then, so again, most of these are Southern Kingdom. Then there are some portions of Ezekiel that talk about what's going to happen after the exile in Babylon. Daniel, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, those are occurring either during or following the Babylonian exile. So again, the narrative content is going to be, again, in those books of Kings or Ezra and Nehemiah. And sometimes the prophet, wherever you're reading in the prophets, it will tell you in the year of so-and-so's reign, this is what is happening now. So anytime it gives you that setting, you want to go back over, refresh, okay, what's going on, and use that to help you with your understanding of what's being said in the oracles. But again, most of this is widespread political upheaval, a lot of corruption, apostasy, turning their back on the covenant. So it's generally bad. If you've read any parts of the Kings and the Chronicles, lots of bad kings, just one after the other. So again, that's kind of our historical context. That's what's going on. This is the time of the people really needing to be reminded of the covenant because of all the unfaithfulness, and God is threatening exactly what was outlined in their agreed covenant, that eventually you will be destroyed, exiled, all these kinds of things. So again, none of these punishments are arbitrary. None of them are just God getting fed up one day and just having at him. All of this was outlined. And you can see it all in Deuteronomy. And all of these things are told way back then, and they all come to pass. So that's our historical context. Next, we're going to talk about the literary context. How are the books organized, and how should we try to analyze them and dissect them? So, the prophets are organized differently than narratives or prose discourse, like some of the other literary genres we talked about. A narrative, it has setting, characters, plot, and it's telling some kind of story, generally in a linear, scenic fashion. Okay, the story has an introduction, or building, conflict, resolution, and or climax, and then resolution. Prose discourse, like we're going to talk about this a lot in the epistles. There is a logic and there is an argument or some kind of persuasion, generally, that the author is trying to get across. So there's a structure and he is moving you and persuading you over the course of of his literary work, generally a letter, what we're going to talk about. He's trying to get some kind of message across. This paragraph is taking a point from this one, which took a point from the previous one. You see a lot of so's, therefores, all this kind of stuff, because it's all tied together. It's building and moving. Prophets are not like that. The prophets were not, they're not written to convey a story necessarily, and they're not written as a structured literary argument. The way that has helped me think about these is try to think. I mean, what they're called is it's an anthology, is what it is. It's a collection of all of these speeches and oracles that the prophets gave over many years. So think about a motivational speaker who works for 20 years or something, and one day they decide to compile all of their material. Okay, they're going to have some common elements that appeared in a lot of their speeches. They're going to be all kinds of different things, different material that they added and dropped off and reorganized. And if you tell them to put it all together in one organized work or one single work, there may not be, A pertains to B, pertains to C, pertains to D. It might just be different kind of thoughts. They might have an internal organization. B might make a lot of sense, but it doesn't necessarily connect to A. It doesn't connect to the oracle. In the case of the prophets, doesn't necessarily connect to the oracle before it. Another thing that helped me is thinking about like a stand-up comedian. Stand-up comedian who has a 30-year career. You say, okay, organize all your material into a big book. Again, not all the jokes are going to tie together. Some of them are going to be, totally contained. Some of them, they might be internally contained, but they have links to other ones. Similar themes that pop back up, similar vocabulary. So to me, that's been kind of a helpful way to think about them, is that they are a collection of sermons that generally occurred over many years. It wasn't just that God said, okay, sit down and write down everything I tell you, and we're all going to knock it out here in one sitting. This is years and years of material. So God is speaking to the prophets, telling them to preach, not always telling them to write, but telling them to preach and tell the people, this is what's going to happen. These are the things that are going on. This is what you're doing. And it's not until later that they're organized and collected. Jeremiah 36 kind of gives an interesting window into kind of this process. So in Jeremiah 36, God tells Jeremiah, hey, I want you to organize all your material. And I think it's been like 20 years or so since he started, and take it and read it to the people. So he hires a scribe. He and the scribe get everything together, and then he goes and the scribe goes and presents the material. And so again, it wasn't all just coming all at one time. There's not always a structure, and the chapters and the subtitles, they can be helpful, but again, we don't always know exactly how big each piece is. There may be one chapter in Hosea that is 3 oracles combined, 3 different, the highlights of 3 different speeches that Hosea made at different times that have been pushed together. So whenever we look at studying the prophets, we can't expect to sit down and read it all in one sitting. A lot of epistles were meant to be read that way. They were meant to be read aloud all in one sitting, to hear the argument, hear the flow of thought. The prophets were not like that. They were not written for you to sit and read or be read to the entire material from start to finish, and it has some intricate connected plot lines. It's not like that. So again, there may be some organization to the oracles, but it's not it's not one continuous flow of thought. So don't feel bad if you've tried to tackle the prophets in the past and you felt like, oh man, I don't know how this connects to this or that or the other, because they may have even been separate oracles given at different times along this prophet's long career. And several of the prophets had careers that were decades long. So like Ezekiel, there's some organization. Like the first, chunk of chapters is, about judgment that's coming. Then the middle section is about, exile, and the last part is about restoration. Ezekiel or whoever assisted him, Jeremiah had a scribe that assisted him. They may have organized all these sermons, at the end and given them some kind of organization at the end, but that's not always how they come out. And again, it's not a letter, it's not a narrative, it's different. So whenever you're reading it, you want to try to figure out, what is this section about, and can I identify, with some reasonable level of certainty, a kind of a start and an end to this collection of thoughts. And we're going to talk more about that here in just a second. There are a lot of different types of oracles. So when I say oracle, I just mean, again, this idea of a section of the book that was contained in, a sermon that the prophet delivered at one time. This one section, verses 13 through 26 of chapter whatever. We want to try to identify, the individual oracles and then categorize them in a way that helps us understand them. So there are a lot of different types of oracles. And so what I want to talk about, and what's been helpful for me, is to actually break it into fewer sections than just all the different types of oracles. So the book outlines several different types of oracles. I think it goes through 5 or 6 of them, and that's not even all of them. I mean, there's lots of different kinds, and we're going to talk about a few here in a second. But for me, too many categories almost gets confusing. And so what's helpful for me is actually, I've heard it broken down into just 3 main categories, or 3 buckets. So anything you encounter in the prophets can generally be put into one of these 3 buckets. Okay? The first bucket is accusation. And this is, I think, about half of all the prophetic material is accusation. And there are different types of accusing oracles. One common one is called the lawsuit oracle, where God is depicted as the prosecutor, the judge, the jury, the plaintiff, in a court case, and Israel or Judah is on trial for their breaking of the covenant. Let me give you an example here. We're going to look at Hosea 4. This is a good one. So Hosea chapter 4. This is a good kind of again. It's accusation, and under the heading of accusation, it is what's called a lawsuit oracle. So I'm just going to start in verse 1. I'm not going to read it all, but you can kind of get the gist of it. So starting in verse 1, it says, "Hear the word of the Lord, O children of Israel. For the Lord has a controversy with the inhabitants of the land. There is no faithfulness or steadfast love, and no knowledge of God in the land. There is swearing, lying, murder, stealing, and committing adultery. They break all bounds, and bloodshed follows bloodshed. Therefore the land mourns, and all who dwell in it languish. And also the beasts of the fields, and the birds of the heavens, and even the fish of the sea are taken away." So in verse 2, he references 5 of the 10 commandments. Again, it's because he's listing these parts of the covenant that you've broken. And it's not that they've broken 5, and they've broken all of them, but he's just listing, several. And again, the audience would know, okay, bam, we just heard 5 of the 10 commandments right after the other. Okay, we're guilty of breaking all of them. We're guilty of breaking so much of the covenant. So again, anytime you open the prophets, accusation, like I said, is I think about half of all the prophetic material. So that can kind of help you break down, and understand what you're reading. A lot of it is God or the prophet, God through the prophet accusing Israel or Judah of wrongdoing, of breaking the covenant. It's not, and the audience isn't always Judah or Israel. Sometimes it's surrounding nations. Could be Babylon, could be Edom, Assyria. A lot of nations get what's coming to them. So accusation is the first bucket. And again, there's kind of sub buckets underneath that. But the second one is a call to repentance. I don't have an example right off the top of my head of this one, but God will offer a chance to avoid the coming calamity if they would just return, if they would just remember the covenant, they would be spared from all the coming destruction. This is a much smaller section or amount of material, but so accusation is the first big bucket, call to repentance is the second one, and the third big bucket we're calling the day of the Lord. And again, just like all the other ones, there are kind of sub buckets underneath this. So the day of the Lord, the two main types are judgment and restoration. So the day of the Lord is something that appears a lot in the prophets. And when you encounter this, it's not just talking about the end of the world, the end of everything. The day of the Lord just means a time when God intervenes in human history. So there are multiple days of the Lord. It's not just the one great day. There are instances where the prophet is talking about the end, or the end of everything. But there are more than one day of the Lord. But oftentimes they are described in the language of the end of all things. So, just going to give you an example. We're going to look in Isaiah 13 really fast. So this is talking about Babylon. Isaiah is delivering an oracle against Babylon, talking about when Babylon is going to get what's coming to it. So again, God uses Babylon to judge Judah by destroying them and exiling them and destroying the temple. But Babylon's going to get what's coming to them as well. They're not going to be, they're not blameless either. So we're going to start in verse 1 of Isaiah 13. It says, "The oracle concerning Babylon, which Isaiah the son of Amoz saw. On a bare hill raise a signal, cry aloud to them. Wave the hand for them to enter the gates of the nobles. I myself have commanded my consecrated ones, and have summoned my mighty men to execute my anger, my proudly exulting ones. The sound of a tumult is on the mountains, as of a great multitude. The sound of an uproar of kingdoms, of nations gathering together. The Lord of hosts is mustering a host for battle. They come from a distant land, from the end of the heavens, the Lord and the weapons of his indignation, to destroy the whole land. Wail, for the day of the Lord is near. As destruction from the Almighty it will come. Therefore all hands will be feeble, and every human heart will melt. They will be dismayed. Pangs and agony will seize them. They will be in anguish like a woman in labor. They will look aghast at one another. Their faces will be aflame. Behold, the day of the Lord comes, cruel with wrath and fierce anger, to make the land a desolation and destroy its sinners from it. For the stars of the heavens and their constellations will not give their light." So this is the part I really want you to listen to. I'm going to start again in verse 10. It said, "For the stars of the heavens and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be dark at its rising, and the moon will not shed its light." So he goes on and says, "I'll punish the people." And it says, verse 13 says, "Therefore I will make the heavens tremble, and the earth will be shaken out of its place at the wrath of the Lord of hosts in the day of his fierce anger." So we're talking about the end of Babylon, something that occurred long ago. And the prophet Isaiah is using apocalyptic language, about the great end. The heavens will shake and the earth will tremble, stars will fall from the sky, and all those kinds of things. So whenever you see apocalyptic language, we can't assume that they're talking only about the end of all things. the great day, the last day of the Lord, because all of these other times in human history when God intervenes, they are often described in the same language. So they use the language about the great end of all things to describe when God acts in human history. So we also see this in the New Testament when Jesus is talking about the signs of the end of the age, and we kind of don't know. Is he talking about the fall of Jerusalem? Is he talking about the great end of all things? Again, don't assume that if you hear about the angels collecting the people from the four corners of the earth. Again, we can't assume that that's talking only about the great end of all things, because this is how the prophets have always described God interacting in human history. There's lots of days of the Lord. And a lot of time they're spoken of like that as it's a day of judgment. It is a day of wrath. But there's also a time of restoration, of rebuilding, that also can fall under the category of the day of the Lord. We see God talking about the end of the Babylonian exile, but then also the restoration of the whole nation. And then again, some of it could even be future to us. When the great day when everything is made right. Evil is punished and done away with, and the righteous are exalted and spared. So both of those again fall under this category of the day of the Lord, and it's another big category. So you have accusation, that covers a lot of it. Call to repentance, that gets you a little bit more. And then the day of the Lord, both for judgment and for restoration, is your third main bucket. And most of what you see is going to fit into one of those. But again, there are subtypes of oracles underneath those, like lawsuits, woes. A lot of the times the prophets will perform what are called sign acts. Ezekiel does a lot of these. So Ezekiel is told by God to build a tiny model of Jerusalem and then build tiny little siege engines destroying it. So that's kind of under the, it's a day of the Lord talking about the coming destruction and judgment, but it's a sign act that is describing that. So Ezekiel does several of those. Isaiah does some that I know of for sure. But so again, there's lots of different ways of breaking it up. But for me personally, having just three main buckets kind of helps me wrap my mind around it a little bit better and a little bit easier. The last thing we're going to talk about really briefly, and I know time goes by so fast, so we're just about done, is the New Testament's usage of Old Testament prophecy. Because a lot of times we assume that if the New Testament writer pulled a prophecy out of the Old Testament, that it was a messianic prophecy. And that's not always the case. An easy example is in Hosea 11. So we're probably all familiar with this once I read it. So Hosea 11, starting in verse 1, it says, "When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. The more they were called, the more they went away. They kept sacrificing to the Baals and burning offerings to idols. Yet it was I who taught Ephraim to walk. I took them up by their arms, but they did not know that I healed them. I led them with cords of kindness, with the bands of love, and I became to them as one who eases the yoke on their jaws, and I bent down to them and fed them." So God is describing through the prophet how Israel was like his child. He calls Israel his firstborn son in Exodus 4. So this oracle has an original context. This is not a messianic prophecy. It's not talking about the prophet likened to Moses who will come. It's not the shoot of Jesse, or branch off the stump of Jesse or anything like that. This has a context. This is about Israel. God talking about Israel as if like Israel was his child. But what the New Testament writers, what Matthew does with this, is he draws an analogy. So we can't assume that every time a prophecy or every time a New Testament writer says something was fulfilled, that it was a messianic prophecy. Um, I think Paul talks about the Israelites getting water from rock in the wilderness, and he calls the rock, that rock was Christ. That's not a messianic thing. I mean, that had an original context, an original meaning. What Paul is doing is he's drawing an analogy. He's saying that Christ is to us like the water from the rock was for them. So we look at that and tend to think, the New Testament writers are kind of playing fast and loose with prophecy here. But again, what they're doing is they're seeing analogies that have a second meaning, a second fulfillment. Again, we can see these connections that they made. We have to be careful about trying to make some of our own, because we don't have the authority or the insight that they had. But again, if you've been confused by this, or if you've noticed this, a lot of those prophecies have an original context and original meaning that meant something to the audience, and it may not have been messianic in the first place, but it has been used by a New Testament writer as something analogous to what is going on now in the new covenant age. That's prophecy. The prophets just really rushed and really quick. I hope that helps. Again, for me, this has kind of helped me. I feel less, lost when I open the prophets. I feel a little bit less scared about trying to understand what's going on. So again, you've got your buckets, you've got your historical context. You can always reference a good commentary or a good Bible dictionary or a study Bible that's got a good introduction that kind of helps you fill in the pieces. But remember, when you dig in, when you tackle it, try to break it apart. Figure out what, can I break this section into a little oracle that may be able to stand on its own, and then figure out kind of where does the oracle fit? What is it saying to who about what? And again, it's poetry, so it's going to say it in very interesting, very flowery sometimes language, very dense and meaningful. So anyway, I hope that you learned something tonight. As always, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to contact me either through leaving a comment on here or seeing me at church sometime. But thank you so much for watching. Next week we will get into the Psalms, and again, let's try to think about how do we use something that was written to God. How is that a word to us? So we're going to talk a little bit about that next week. Thanks very much for joining, and I'll see you later.